that is not the right one. From the southernmost point of Dorne to the lands of always winter, west of west, and what is under the shadows in the east, it's all here, and we are here for Casterly Talk. I'm Ken Napzok for another edition of the show that takes a fun, sometimes deep, but always fun look at World of Ice and Fire. That's HBO's Game of Thrones. That's A Song of Ice and Fire. That's Fire and Blood. That's the prequel series and a lot more. We're going to be doing some dives into historical moments, into characters. There's a lot to discuss, a lot to talk about, a lot to celebrate of Game of Thrones and the World of Ice and Fire, but I can't always do that alone. I'll tell you today, I had Rachel Cushing in my house today, but she was dropping off something, and we couldn't record. We're both so busy getting ready for Comic-Con, but I did want to make time to bring this fellow back to the show from the great white north beyond our own wall. Thomas Rissling is here. We can call him Sir Thomas at all. How you doing, Thomas?
I'm doing wonderful, Ken. Thank you so much for having me back on. We got a little bit of exciting news that teased us that we get to talk about today.
Ooh, you know, we kept saying when the decision to keep Casterly Talk going, I mean, Lon Harris creates this name for a show. We can't let it go to waste. So it's like, well, you know, we'll start talking about the prequel series. I can't believe I think we're starting to ramp up. They're shooting now. We're going to start getting things, whether it's official or not. I don't like to look at the leaks, but things are going to start emerging. And Thomas, this past week, kind of out of nowhere, Entertainment Weekly sat down with George R. R. Martin, and we got a tease, my friend.
We certainly did. You know, we got not a whole lot, but enough to keep us going. And like you said, you know, maybe this is the beginning of the floodgates. Maybe we're about to start seeing some more roll out. So
now, off air, Thomas, and you and I were talking. You had a pretty good, I'll call it a pretty good bet if you were making bets. We got Comic-Con coming up, San Diego Comic-Con, the granddaddy of them all, where Game of Thrones has always been a star. The show, the cast members, I've met a lot of them. I've partied with a couple of them. I've stayed at the same hotel because they are always there. Game of Thrones and San Diego Comic-Con have kind of gone hand in hand, and they're going to have some sort of presence there. Thomas, you're saying, what if we get some information at the end of this panel?
Yeah, you know, this reunion panel is really exciting, I think, for all of us fans, but that possibility of maybe Jane Goldman or even George himself walking out and presenting, maybe it's some concept art or maybe it's even a clip, who knows? But it's a hard thing to guess what we might get. I think we're just hoping we might get something. What's
interesting about this possibility, and again, Thomas and I are, to borrow a phrase from our Force Center friends, Joseph Grimshaw, Jennifer Lander, and myself, that's weird, speculate responsibly, which means, hey, speculate, have fun, go wild, but rein it in. Don't build up expectations that can't be met. I know the show, it's two separate teams. It's HBO and George R. R. Martin, but, you know, we got Jane Goldman putting together the show and the pilot. It's not Dan and David. It's not everyone, we're different time period. But the big question I've had, Thomas, and before we get into some of these points is, you know, is it the same world or is it book world? Is it a continuation of that? But will it live in that same universe that the show lives in? If they're at this panel, this reunion panel, Thomas, and they walk out at the end and go, yeah, hey, look, it's definitely the same. That's going to be extra exciting, right?
Yeah, and I think it almost, to some extent, it almost would have to be. We've been told that this series is going to take place roughly 5,000 years before the events of the main series. Mm. And if we look at where the Long Night actually falls, and granted, HBO is kind of slapping George in the wrist saying, don't call it the Long Night. That being said, you know, the Long Night was said to have taken place roughly 8,000 years before the events of that series. So there's like a 3,000 year discrepancy there. So it makes me wonder if 5,000 years, maybe that's when it happened in the show.
Yeah, and George has talked about the kind of the moving goalposts of history within his world and how he's built in this, like, well, we don't know. There was some stuff written on stones. There's some maesters transcribed some things, maybe left some stuff out. So I've always been excited about the possibility of George and Jane Goldman and her team kind of getting together to answer maybe more of his history. But yeah, you're right. You might have just said it. This could be the show's history, which I kind of like that idea of it being, making sure it's connected more to the show's history.
Yeah, that's really important for me. You know, I think even for us book readers, there's a lot of joy in having two versions of the story. I know you talked about this last week. Douglas Adams was very, very fond of redoing his own work, but he always wanted it to be different. And George is very similar. He actually said a very similar thing on the Maltons podcast. So it's quite interesting to look at this, I really hope we are going to get a show history here, because I think diving into book history and having two separate continuities within the same property could really make things problematic as far as television shows go.
Absolutely. Let's take a look into, there's 5 points that they kind of brought up here in this Entertainment Weekly article put together and written by James Hibbard. So we'll give him some credit because we are certainly just talking about this wonderful little piece of work here. We do know that the pilot is currently filming in Northern Ireland. Jane Goldman at the helm there. That itself, that's not one of the 5 points, Thomas, but I get this way with Star Wars. Do you get this way with Game of Thrones where like, oh my gosh, they're making the next thing, the next part of the story, and I'm just so excited, and it's crazy that it's happening now. Do you kind of get am I the only one that gets these weird nerd chills?
Yeah, I definitely get the nerd chills, and I'm almost shocked that we're getting such a deep nerd dive into this world immediately after, so soon. Right. It's mildly surprising, but also very, very exciting, and I definitely do get the excitement of, what are we looking at? You know, what are they filming up in Northern Ireland there? We kind of know what they've used it for in the past, but I mean, movie magic or TV magic, who knows what they're going to do? Absolutely.
Here we go. Reading from the points there. Westeros is divided into roughly 100 kingdoms in the prequel. And this is Martin himself. I'm reading directly from the article here. We talk about the 7 kingdoms of Westeros. There were 7 kingdoms at the time of Aegon's conquest, which, as we know, roughly, we got about 300 years before the events of Game of Thrones. But if you go back further, there are 9 kingdoms and 12 kingdoms, and eventually you get back to where there are 100 kingdoms, petty kingdoms, and that's the era we're talking about here. So while the 7 kingdoms maintain some degree of order, Thomas, it sounds like we got possibilities for a lot more or grander scale political intrigue and power plays. What do you think about all that?
I think we're also looking at some added chaos and conflict. You know, going back that far without being united under one king and all of the, like you said, hundreds of kingdoms. We're talking about many more wars playing out on smaller scales, like small battles playing out all over the place almost all the time. We're talking about, the kings of the rivers and hills, which, House Mud, House Fisher, depending on where this falls. Yeah. But this is a very feudal, constantly in flux state in Westeros in this time period. Whereas, again, we're familiar with this, even though it is very hectic and very politically charged. The world of Westeros we've been introduced to with the Game of Thrones series has been a little more controlled, like the article says, and a little more
focused a little bit.
Yeah, focused. Yeah.
Yeah, and we know, and we're going to talk about it here in a second, it's one of the points here, the specter of the White Walkers or the others are absolutely going to be over the show, but I like what you're talking about, Thomas, because I get this a lot, and again, it's easy to make the comparisons to Star Wars. It's totally different, but it's these 2 big properties I love. When you look at things before even the prequel, some of these stories, I feel they're all great and they're insight into characters we love, but unless you're talking about Old Republic, thousands of years ago, Jedi, Sith, the other stuff always seems to be, it's a band of pirates, it's a criminal syndicate, and those are great stories, but they lack, to me, the big, giant rebellion versus the Empire, separatists versus the Republic. So here in Game of Thrones, I think you're right. We don't just have pirates coming to raid shores, we've got kingdoms, we've got houses fighting each other and jockeying for position, and that gives me hope that there's going to be a lot of stories to tell.
Yeah, and I think, the idea of kind of pirates and that kind of stuff in Star Wars, I think the reason that it's not the same as Resistance, First Order, Rebellion, Empire is that there isn't the same impact. It's not felt across the galaxy or in this case across the known world. Whereas I think we're going to see a little bit of that, where it's not affecting so much of the known world. We're not jumping from continent to continent. We're seeing these small feuds play out and resolve within Westeros to kind of begin shaping up to the Westeros we are somewhat familiar with.
Yeah, because this period of time, we've talked about this age of heroes. I mean, that isn't like 20 years. This spans thousands, exactly. So it's like, when does it fall? And do we get some of those big answers to what part of the legends are true, what part aren't, how much of it's magic, all these wonderful things. But I like that for those who fell in love with Game of Thrones, HBO's Game of Thrones, because of the politics, because of the intrigue, because of the whispers and rumors in courtyards and the power, the chess pieces being moved, you're going to have a lot of that if that's what you love, right?
Yeah, and I think for all Game of Thrones fans, that's definitely a part of what drew most of us in. There's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of, war being played out in rooms over glasses of wine. Really.
Yes.
That's such an interesting concept that you can sit two highly intelligent people down and solve a conflict of tens of thousands of people in a matter of minutes.
Love that. But there are going to be familiar names, at least house names, and creatures. We know, this is, I'm reading again from the article from George R. R. Martin himself. He says the Starks will definitely be there. While much has been made about the fact that prequel predates dragons, that doesn't mean there won't be creatures. That's actually from Entertainment Weekly, that last line. George goes on to say, obviously the White Walkers are here, or as they're called in my books, the others, and that will be an aspect of it. There are things like direwolves and mammoths. So, breaking that down, Thomas, House Stark, not a surprise. It makes sense, again, when you're talking about the show, to the casual fan, and I'm talking about the people who do love the show and have watched it a couple times, but haven't touched the books and the maps, and maybe they don't listen to Casterly Talk yet. These are the people that are going to be like, oh, a new Game of Thrones series, it's got Starks, I'm at least there for that. I think that's not a surprise, but it's valuable.
Yeah, I agreed. And adding direwolves doesn't hurt at all. The fact that they've said creatures, and I know that's from the article, not from George's quote, that also makes me think of things like ice spiders and, maybe more giant whites and maybe some of the things that we've been hinted at in the books. We might see some of those creatures come to life on screen.
Maybe we just go back to old Nan's stories, both book and show, and start making a checklist of things old Nan said. That'd be the case.
The other thing with the White Walkers here that I find interesting is we know they're being included, and the Long Night. Where do you actually think the Long Night's going to fall into this story? That's the hardest part I'm having with this. Let's dive into that, because we got the mammoths here. We got this kind of hopefully I'm on board for your ice spiders talk there. Does it? It makes sense to me from afar, but I never like to be right, because I want them to surprise me. I want the creators to surpass my own thoughts and expectations. The fact that this might build to the Long Night always made sense to me, but now coming out of the Long Night and how maybe it's also a little bit about how we bury this kind of truth and run away from it, so that the fact when you sync it up to Game of Thrones, the fact that everyone's like, oh, that didn't happen. Like, how do we get to that point? Maybe it's the other way around. It starts with the Long Night. Well, and I have this kind of vision that plays out in my head, this cold open, much like the cold open we get in the pilot of the main series with, Garrett and Will and blanking on the third dude's name.
Raymer Royce. Raymer Royce.
Raymer Royce, yeah. Go north and they end up bumping into the White Walkers and the Whites. Yeah. I wonder if maybe the cold open of this prequel could be something along the lines of the end of the Long Night.
Interesting. Yeah, I could dig that, and I had never thought about that till I read this article. Of it just again seems like, hey, let's build to it, but that would be too similar, I think, to what we just experienced for 8 seasons: politics, power, fighting, and the specter of a supernatural threat. But what you just talked about, Thomas. Imagine we start with this big battle. We start with the Age of Heroes, this kind of beginning here. I'm creating unhealthy expectations for wanting that.
And so am I. I mean, Jamie, it's hard to ignore the resemblance too between Jamie Campbell Bower and Vladimir Furtick, the guy who plays the Night King.
Right.
It's very hard to ignore that as well. So when you see things like this, and you kind of have to assume we're gonna see. I know we talked about this previously, but you kind of have to assume we're going to see something about the Night King. If this is all going to tie in that way, that would kind of be the one character you'd expect to make the tie-in.
Especially, again, tying it to that show world. This is why I'm more and more on board for that. Let George answer some of the questions about, the Night's King, the 13th Lord Commander, the Night's Watch going north and marrying a woman with blue eyes. That's something else to me, and that's something I want answers for, and I'm hoping to get soon in books. But I like this idea of George getting to answer with Jane Golban. Hey, the guy we saw in this show, how did that happen? We know how it begun, but what happens there? Like a younger version, and filling out his backstory. It's kind of intriguing.
Yeah, and there's some interest for me too in the character of the last hero, and how they may use that with this. I mean, that's well after and towards the end of the Long Night, but it makes me wonder if maybe they're going to tie together the character of the Night King and his creation along with that story of the last hero. So there's some possibility for that as well.
Absolutely. And our third point here, all right, we got House Stark, but another popular house that, hey, I'm one of the people that loves them, not going to be there, at least not at the beginning. There will, point 3, there will not be any Lannisters, at least not at first. The prequel predates the rise of the Lannister family. George Martin says the Lannisters aren't there yet, but Casterly Rock is certainly there. It's like the Rock of Gibraltar. It's actually occupied by the Casterlys, for whom it's still named after in the time of Game of Thrones. So as we know, Lan the Clever swindled the Casterlys out of Casterly Rock. So that would be, we've talked about wanting to see that. It would make sense, Thomas, then that we start with no House Lannister as we know it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many versions of the Lan story. There's the most common, where he kind of sneaks in and deceives everybody. But there's also 3 or 4 other potential ways that story actually played out in the history of this world. So it's another one of these things where George kind of gets to pick from a hat and say, oh, maybe go for this. And maybe Jane Goldman thinks that's a great idea and they run with it. I think to ignore Lan in this series would be a mistake. To be honest, that story is one of the most intriguing, I think, especially as a prequel. Casterly Rock is something that most watchers are familiar with the name and know what it is.
Yeah, because if you're trying to get some of these histories, and we got the continuing story of House Stark, which goes all the way back to the First Men and all that kind of stuff. But then now, if you're going to start doing a checklist of the houses and how they began, like you said, Lan the Clever, that's probably one of the more interesting ones. I think, Oris Baratheon, actually that's with Aegon, excuse me. But the House Baratheons beginning and out of everything going on in Storm's End. That's interesting, very interesting, but it's very potentially magical if any of it's true.
Yeah, and there's some chance for conflict too with the King of the River, or River King, sorry, and the King of the Stormlands at that time. So if we could potentially see that play out in a big way as well. Yeah,
and that could emerge. And it's funny, we look at the list of even more than just the list, but the pictures of those cast, and you start going, oh, Lannister, Stark, this and if we don't have Lannisters up front, that's intriguing to me. At least in the form of House Lannister. Maybe Lan the Clever is there early on at the end of season 1. We're waiting for the story to happen. And I like what you said too, Thomas. Is if again, going to some stuff I said before, of George getting to, not just him, but getting to help answer his own histories and saying this is what really happened. That's intriguing.
Yeah, and there's also some interest around the idea of Lan for me. And if they're creating, a show history with this and going back and it's directly a show prequel, I think there's some interest for me in maybe doing a bit of a history switch here. Maybe Naomi Watts is actually the Lan type character. Right? And maybe this world that has become so dependent on the opinions of men has essentially rewritten history to say, no, this was a man named Lan who did all of these things.
I like that kind of idea. I like that. Oh, we're creating these expectations, Thomas. We got to be careful here. I know, no, but it's intriguing. It's part of the fun of this, obviously. And I really love this point. I love this point when you hear a new Star Wars project announced, or the next chapter of the sagas in an early stage, because we don't know nothing. I love seeing a good trailer. I love seeing shots of what's coming, but I love this little period of time where we know it exists, but we know nothing, and that's part of the fun of being a fan. And so you can see Naomi Watts, and then that inspires some kind of story in your mind.
Yeah, and I love being wrong. We said this earlier as well, but I love being wrong. Every time I make a prediction, I'm really hoping it's not going to be true.
This is one of the only areas of life, that I love to be wrong. I'm like you.
Yeah, there's some real joy there, right?
We talk about Naomi Watts, and obviously she's cast. There's a lot of newer names, unknown names, and names that we're starting to know. We obviously know Naomi Watts. Naomi Aki, who's going to be in Star Wars Episode 9, and Denise Go, our Gao, Go. I say Go because Summer Van Gogh there. They are. It's been kind of this. This is what the article's kind of reinforcing, that HBO's early on has kind of suggested that these female characters, female performers, are going to be the leads. But that is not necessarily true, according to George R. R. Martin. He reminds us that, as you know, Game of Thrones, we never even nominated anybody for lead actress or lead actor during the award season until recently. It was always for supporting categories, but the show is very much an ensemble, and I think that will be true for this show, too. We don't have leads so much as a large ensemble cast. And that makes sense on a lot of levels, too. too, where season 1 and 2 of Game of Thrones, you are introducing a lot of characters before a lot of the main ones die off. Obviously you got Sean Bean as Ned Stark, and he was on the posters for a reason. Probably it's like, hey, Boromir and 006, they're Trevelyan. He's in this one. Come on, watch it. I think you're going to see that with Naomi Watts, but I understand what George is saying, that at least early on, until you start paring down the characters as people start going away and dying, I think it needs to be an ensemble. It makes it more powerful.
Yeah, and I think it also reflects the world that it's set in. With a Game of Thrones, or Game of Thrones, the series, it jumps around like that in the first season. New watchers have a hard time kind of grasping who the characters are because there's so many characters and places to visit. Yeah. That's not going to be lessened by this prequel.
I think I think you're right. I think it's going to be somewhat, I guess maybe worse is the word for, again, that casual fan. I'm not using that as kind of a snide comment or description of someone, but just like, I love Game of Thrones. I own some Funko Pops. I've seen all the seasons 2 or 3 times. But you might not know the rich history, and this is your opportunity to. But yeah, you're going to suddenly 100 or so, even 12 petty kingdoms. It's going to bring a lot of new players to the front, and I think we're going to hear that same thing again of, whose story is this? Who's that? What happens to them? I need to know.
Yeah, and then I guess the flip side is that it could always be, maybe they are purposely going smaller, and maybe even although there is 100 or so these smaller petty kings and petty kingdoms, maybe we're going to see it really focus on the ideals and goals of a couple.
Yeah, I think you need possible. That.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Sorry, I cut you off there.
No worries.
Never cut off a Canadian in conversation. It's just not polite.
No, you get too many apologies back.
That's exactly right. No, I agree with that too, where, obviously it's going to focus on, because I feel Game of Thrones, in the end, seemed to be House Stark, House Lannister, House Targaryen. That's making us no great insight there. But going back to season 1, when even I was still not as familiar with the story, it seemed this is all about House Stark. Now, that isn't 100% correct, but I'm just saying, from someone who was watching it back then, it was like, oh, this is what happens to the Stark family. In the end, there's a lot of, the house that kind of remained is the Starks, but you know what I mean? Like, along the way, all these other houses and characters and quests become important and move to the forefront. But I think early on, there was so much going on, I just had to naturally focus on these characters I was spending a lot of time with.
Yeah, and I think that's natural. I think for all of us, the more characters, or the characters we spend the most time with, are going to be the ones we tend to gravitate towards. Obviously, there's some exceptions to that, but that's typically how things are written. If you had to pick a protagonist for Game of Thrones, you would probably choose Jon or Dany, depending on who you prefer.
Right.
And I think that's fair, but it also, you could pick probably a dozen other protagonists for the story.
Yeah. Absolutely. Song of Ice and Fire. That would mean Jon and Dany to some here. Final point here, Thomas. The show might get a slightly different title than the one you're expecting. We have heard, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it was George that kind of suggested it, that The Long Night would be the title of the not the episode, but the show. We, of course, know we got The Long Night episode in season 8 of Game of Thrones. So George is saying that's not necessarily the case. That The Long Night remains his preferred title, which I think does give a clue to what will be happening in the show, at least at some point, like we were talking about earlier. But he said, I heard a suggestion to be called The Longest Night, which is a variant I wouldn't mind. That would be pretty good. Sometimes it's hard to tell, much like a Mark Hamill tweet, if George is joking or not. So just going off there, though, if he is thinking, he has put that out there, that The Long Night would be his preferred title. That makes a lot of sense. Do either of those work for you, though? The Longest Night does not work for me at this point. Doesn't matter. I'll watch whatever they call it. They could call it Dire Wolf and Mammoth Show. I'm there. But what do you think about those titles?
The Longest Night is immediately in my mind. I'm like, okay, they just went bigger. The Long Night, I think it would fit. But to be honest, I don't think we've actually seen what the title's going to be. I know there was that floating around, the working title of Blood Moon. And I think that's a working title and nothing more. But again, could be very wrong. The Longest Night would not work for me. I feel like it's just blatantly trying to make something bigger than the last. And with that episode, 803 being titled The Long Night, if they're going to do The Long Night again, there almost needs to be some sort of symmetry there. Right? And I think that's also a hard sell, because then when you're discussing The Long Night, or even Googling it, if you Google Game of Thrones, The Long Night, Are you going to come up with the episode or the show?
Yeah. Oh,
right? This creates another issue there as well, right?
You got to worry about SEO. You got to worry about that, kids. When you're setting up your shows and your podcasts and everything, search engine optimize your titles. I agree with you. And The Longest Night sounds like a very good crime thriller set in the 60s in the Deep South. You know, like, and Blood Moon's good. Like, they'll find the right title, whatever it is. It's Game of Thrones couldn't have been a more perfect title. And obviously you're taking it from a choice of several books. HBO's A Clash of Kings, obviously that just is a certain period of time within the story. But Game of Thrones, what a perfect title. It's going to be hard to surpass that. It's going to be
that's a really hard one to beat. Like you said, the following books have great titles, but they are very reflective of the story they tell and the time period they fall within. Yeah. Whereas a Game of Thrones is kind of an all-encompassing, it is a Game of Thrones. The line is used
all the way to the very end.
Yep.
Yeah. You got to do the test. You got to do that HBO, the static. And now HBO's Mammoths and Direwolves. It's just, you got to keep testing it and find the one that works. HBO's Blood Moon. Like, the vampires are back. Like, you got it's a tough one. Luckily though, Thomas, people with a lot more zeros in their paychecks are going to be the ones deciding the important marketing things like titles.
Yes, I'm okay to just sit back and find out what happens.
Thomas, we're going to take a little break and come back and answer some fun calls, including what kind of sigil we would have. And we've got a correspondent calling in from Con of Thrones. Stick around. We'll be right back here on Casterly Talk. And we're back here on Casterly Talk. It's the 25th episode of Casterly Talk. Of course, we had like 190 or so episodes of Daily Thrones, and one of my regular callers back then is now one of the personalities on the show. He's still with us here after the break. Thomas Rissling. How you doing, Thomas? You hanging in up there?
I'm doing great. Yeah, we're lucky up here in the Great White North. It's actually not that bad today. It's pretty sunny.
Good. Sunny and what? 30 degrees in my degrees? What is it?
I think we're about 25 in Celsius, so somewhere mid 80s mark, I think.
Oh, okay. Similar to what I'm dealing in beautiful Burbank right now. Yeah. All right, we have the ability to take these messages from you out there in Anchorland. If you want to contact us here at Casterly Talk, you just go to the Anchor app, which is easy. You just do it on your phone. You can go on the desktop, and you can leave a message, and you've got about 59 seconds. Get it in, get your point across, have some fun with it. We have put a call last week, I did the solo episode, and I put a call out for what ifs based off some stuff we're talking about on the show. And what if this happened? And what if what would happen after that? Kind of the butterfly effect. And we got some great calls. I got some in the hopper now. So if you don't hear those today, I'm going to hold those off a little bit and maybe get a little more. And next week, I'm going to have to pre-tape an episode real early because I'm heading down to San Diego Comic-Con. I think that's going to be fun next week. But I got Thomas here now, so I do want to take some calls. And we got a couple Thomas here. First, I'm going to take this one from our, like I said, a correspondent. We got a correspondent live on the floor. Well, not live, but it's Mark from Mark Talk. He's attending Con of Thrones in Nashville, and let's hear what he's got to say.
Hey, Ken and all the Casterly Talk people. This is your friend Mark from Mark Talk coming to you live from Con of Thrones in Nashville. And it is just as fun and crazy as you can probably imagine. A lot of cosplayers, a lot of interesting games, a lot of cool surprises and guests here. And Ken, I guess I just wanted to put to you, what is something you would like to see if you were to attend a Game of Thrones style convention? I'm not sure if you've been to them before, but I know you have been to many conventions in your day. So what would you specifically want if you were going to go to a Game of Thrones convention? Lots of love to you. I'm representing you over here in Nashville.
All right. I love that call from Mark. Mark, someone used to call him Daily Thrones as well. Check out his show, Mark Talk, here on Anchor. I love that he's representing us out there because I'll be honest, I don't know about you, Thomas, I always forget about Con of Thrones.
As do I. It's relatively small. But it always yields some great news and great clips and stuff like that. So it's always fun to kind of keep tabs on.
Yeah, I definitely want to get there. I plan on it one day. Just want to. It's this year. It's so close to San Diego Comic-Con. It's just that's a hard sell for a lot of people. But to Mark's question, if I was to go to not necessarily Con of Thrones, but just like a new Game of Thrones con, like what one I am not a huge fan of panels. So some of them are really fun. I've hosted panels. I hope to host more. They're interesting, and there's a way to make them work. But a lot of panels aren't overly entertaining, overly insightful. They're just some people who are uncomfortable being in front of microphones, and that includes some big actors sitting there answering Q&A questions that sometimes they just can't answer or don't have the answers for or don't want to answer. I'm not a huge fan of panels. So if I was to go to a Con of Thrones or my dream kind of Game of Thrones related thing, I want a lot of interactive things. Give me some, not just cosplay, but I want like the tourney for the hand with Ned Stark in honor of Ned Stark. Act that out. I want people jousting. I know one of my friends, Jay. He's a professional jouster. I want him up pretending to be the Mountain. I want to experience it almost as if it's a Renaissance fair. Let's get into the world. I don't necessarily have to put on a coat of armor and walk around, but I want to feel almost like we got with Galaxy's Edge. I haven't been there yet, but I want to be a part of it. And cool things on display, and more, if not so much panels as just events and entertaining things to attend. What about you, Thomas?
Yeah, I'm very similar. I envision sort of a Renaissance fair that feels very in-world. Mm-hmm. I feel like for a Game of Thrones convention, there's got to be a real special hook there, and I think it comes from the interactivity and things like that. And you know what? I'm actually with you. I'm not a huge panels person, but if I had to pick one panel that I'd want to see at a Game of Thrones convention, it would be Elio Garcia and Linda Antonsen, the ones who helped George with all the continuity stuff.
Yeah.
It'd be a very, very interesting listen. And, especially for the fans that want to go up and ask George questions that stump him, you're not going to stump those two.
That'd be fascinating. That'd be amazing. Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. But again, more interactivity. Again, I'd love to see a joust. Like you said, I think that'd be a lot of fun. You could even do something with foam swords and White Walkers. There's a lot of opportunity for fun and interactivity within a Game of Thrones convention.
Yeah, that's kind of San Diego Comic-Con is so crazy. Thomas, I don't think you've had a chance to go to San Diego, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. It's so big, and there's so many people, and the floor is interesting, but you're cramped shoulder to shoulder. It's the stuff around it. It's the community, and I think that's probably the best thing about Con of Thrones, having not attended it before I got to assume it, where you were around like-minded, passionate fans. Star Wars Celebration obviously comes to mind. That is the true draw more than anything that goes on there, and I'm sure Mark's having a great time, and hopefully telling people about Casterly Talk. But yeah, I think to me that's the true important part of these big conventions. Finding your friends.
Exactly, and we go to them for experiences, and to go there for the experience of meeting new friends or finding friends you're whether you're friends online or each other personally. There's a real experience aside from the con invented experiences, things like we just talked about. There's a real experience just in the idea of going with people that you care about. Or people that share that similar love for a property as you. And it's like you said with Galaxy's Edge, there's, I haven't been there yet either, but there's this idea of everyone is so happy because they get to go in and see something they never thought they'd see. Mm-hmm. My idea, I'd love to walk in and sit down and have a feast in the world of Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
How much fun would that be?
I wouldn't want eel pie, but yeah, it's fun. Like, thinking back a couple years ago when I was still working for Collider, we went down and we did the Game of Thrones experience that was during the middle of season 7. It was a weird spot because episode 1 and 2 had already aired, I think. And they had that wonderful display, and it's official. And they come down and they got the Iron Thrones there, and they got the chair, the throne at Dragonstone, and then they got my favorite thing was the painted table, and I just could have spent hours in front of it. That was more fun not just it's not about the photo opportunity, because they had some fun things. You could sit there while everyone chanted King of the North or Queen of the North, all that stuff. But to actually sit in front of the painted table and just feel as though I was Stannis. Of course, I'd go there. You might go another spot. Some of you might want to be Danny. But just standing in front of it going, I feel like I'm in it. That's very exciting for me as a fan.
Yeah, and I'd very much love the opportunity to do a grim Stannis scowl and march my way up to the painted table and even have some sort of I grew up playing Risk.
Yeah.
So how cool would it be, if they cycle people through every 20 minutes to play small games of strategic combat on the painted table?
There you go. I like that. Oh man,
those types of experiences.
Speaking to my heart there. All right, we got another call here from our friend Jay over to Amateur Dads. Let's hear what he's got to say.
Hey, Ken, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a different question this week and have a creative one for you. If you wanted to, or if you could, create a house sigil for House Napzok, what would it be? What would your house colors be? What would you select? What animal would you select? Or would it be an object? Would it be a microphone for all your podcasting? Who knows? Also, what would the house words, what house words would you choose? I'm not sure the house words for my own, but perhaps a jasper on a field of black, red, and silver for myself. And just wondering your thoughts, and anybody else who would want to chime in at the hashtag Casterly Talk.
I love that. I love that he's getting the shout out and how to interact on Twitter down. Hashtag Casterly Talk. All right, Thomas. House Rissling is what you got to work with. I got House Napzok, and I like his idea there that I might have a microphone. That would make sense. It's a passion of mine. I was thinking my house words might be ours is the McFlurry, and I would just have a thing of McDonald's ice cream on a shield. But I think I might have to go with the microphone. I like that idea. I can't move away from it. But the background, I'm trying to think, is it like a starburst? It's definitely not. Melisandre's not in my life, so I don't have a flaming microphone. But maybe I love pine trees. Maybe I love a nice casual hike. So maybe a microphone and a vista of mountains. And I'll think of my house words. What's your sigil?
I can see that. So I think for me, I'd probably do something like a two color background. So you'd have a lower field of blue with the upper part being red, and you'd have a white sturgeon kind of coming out of the blue over the red.
Nice.
My family's been involved with charity work around white sturgeon in the Fraser River here, so it's something that's always been close to me.
There you go.
So that's kind of the animal I've always wanted to use for that, and they're also a beautiful fish with these weird spikes all over them, so it also looks mildly sinister on a sigil.
Yeah.
And as far as words, I really have no idea what the words would be.
Yeah.
We do not suck.
I don't know. Mine would have to be nap and relax, or ours is the relaxation, something like that. Being silly, of course, but it would have to work. It would have to work in those times. And as I definitely a nice forest green over a black and something are definitely my colors. I always have some sort of black on and a purple shirt or a pink shirt or a green shirt or purple shoes or something. So maybe a nice lavender would work as well. But I like your colors too.
Yeah, it sounds great. I've kind of cheated a little bit. I've used this before for a Game of Thrones roleplay.
Well, that's not cheating, man. You already have the answer. I don't.
I should have come up with words.
Words. Yeah. You got to complete your words. Maybe out there, if you're listening, what are House Rissling's words? What are House Napzok's words? I do want to know. It might be something related to 7-Eleven as well. I can totally respect that. So thanks for that call, Jay from Amateur Dads. Thank you, Mark. Attending Con of Thrones out there in Nashville, which is one of my favorite cities in America. I do want to get back there. So, Thomas, we're almost done here, wrapping on up. But it's an interesting time as we head into San Diego Comic-Con next week at the time of this recording. Could be some information dropping, could not, but then it could be like this, Entertainment Weekly. This was kind of out of nowhere. Here's a tidbit of information. We're in that period of time where this is going to start coming.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if, maybe George being whatever level of involvement he has, it seems fairly minimal, but whatever level of involvement he has, who knows? Maybe he's just going to keep kind of dropping little tidbits like this here and there if regardless of whether we get something at San Diego Comic-Con or not.
Absolutely. And a final point on that, I absolutely love that George is involved with this on any level. It's more than just a stamp of approval, but it shows how much he cares about this world that he created and how he still wants to be in charge of it. And he could have said, great, I'm going to finish the books and do other things. HBO, you develop these shows. But he had a hand in all, 4 or 5 or even more of the projects that were out there that could still somehow see the light of day. Who knows? But I love that he's there, you know?
Yeah, and I love that Douglas Adams mentality of, hey, why do the same thing twice?
Yeah.
You know, if I can be involved and answer some questions in a different way or do it maybe, you know, a way that I thought of after the fact that might have been more suitable. You know, I'm very excited for that.
Absolutely. Me too. More stuff is coming. Thomas, we're almost out of here, but I want the folks to know where they can listen to you because you have your show, your Rumination Show. We'll get some ruminations from the realm here again on Casterly Talk shortly. And you and I are working on some stuff. We're getting our schedules in line to have some different kind of episodes here in Casterly Talk, more deep dives into history and everything. But where can they find everything you do?
Yeah, so you can find me on the Ruminations podcast on Anchor and on about 8 other platforms, all the major ones. On Ruminations, I kind of discuss all things nerdy, and then I'll dive into some deeper, more personal subjects with close friends and acquaintances and family members, things like that. You can also find me on Twitter at Thomas Rissling, and that's pretty much it.
Absolutely. Sometimes you might hear us call him Sir Thomas Sital because that is the name that he once had, and I love it to this day. So, Thomas, thank you. We love having you on here on Casterly Talk. We'll hear from him again shortly, and the other players of this show, Lon Harris, Rachel Cushing, Andres Cabrera. You can find and follow them, and they'll be back on the show soon. I knew this was going to be a little bit of a downtime. We got a lot of stuff going on in our lives individually. Rachel recently moved. Lon Harris is cranking out some Screen Junkie stuff as they start to head to Comic-Con, and Andres has got a lot going on with his podcast, The Meaning of, with Robert Butler III. But don't worry, it's not just going to be me. A lot of voices coming in here, and I got some guests I'm trying to get into. But everything, a lot of their life is divided into pre and post Comic-Con for a lot of people in my business. So stay tuned. More's coming. You can follow me at Ken Napzok and go to kennapzok.com for information on all the things I do. And you can also pick up a copy of my book, Why We Love Star Wars. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, Target.com, and a lot of places where books are sold. So that is it for now. We'll see ya on Casterly Talk.